Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the musician and songwriter David Jenkins, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. In the band, the Motion. So you're going to find out more about them and his life in music, creativity and much, much more. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years and the musical awakening. Anyway, David, it's over to you.
Oh, it would have to be the Beatles. I mean, I grew up in a household that neither of my parents were musicians. They were both involved in the acting and the theater world, but they both loved music. And my earliest memories, other than hearing the radio or whatever, were by the time we settled out here in California, which would be 1970, my folks were in a touring company of a Broadway show. And then their marriage ended, but I went back and forth for a little while between Los Angeles and San Francisco, where my father moved to. And so I always remember listening to records in either my mother's apartment or my father's place. And, it was of the time they both had Beatles records. And my mom also had a mixture of everything from Barbra Streisand to Bob Dylan and cast albums and show tunes and stuff. But the Beatles would definitely have been my formative musical thing. And I didn't really have any knowledge of them existing or not, just that I liked these records and I knew them, which at the time I think were Sgt. Pepper, Revolver, and Abbey Road were the three that my mom had. And that was my beginning of getting interested in music as a active listener.
Yes. Well, that's interesting because I suppose I'd slightly caught a few of the Beatles films when I was very young. And obviously anything on telly at that time was it felt very precious because we only had 3 channels in this country. And if something was on, it was on and it was gone and it would be never seen again. So those Beatles films were very good. But I had a brother who was a bit older than me, 7 years. And in the kind of early 70s, he started getting a record collection. He was very into prog rock, like, yes, Genesis, Wishbone Ash, Barclay James Harps. But he also had 2 other albums which had a huge influence, which was the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper and also Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John. But I was mesmerized by both of these records because obviously he said, do not go into my room and play my record. So I obviously sneaked into his room. And would put these on, and at the time, you forget that the Beatles would have only broken up about 3 years before, but that was like another whole other world, wasn't it? When a previous decade when you're young feels like, well, that's just very old, isn't it? But I was mesmerized with the lyrics and the kind of like the imagery of the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper. And there was a song on it which I just still love, is Good Morning, which was on side 2. And I just remember that rhythm and that narrative that runs through. It's just incredible, really, to a young person. That's
Well, I mean, that's so. At that time, I'm absorbing those records, and then I listened to whatever's on the radio. Or if my mom learned how to drive when we moved out here, so I'd go in the car with her to run her errands. I spent a lot of time hanging out with my folks. My father eventually remarried and moved back down to Los Angeles, and I would just always be going around with them after school or when they were doing their things, or so I heard a lot of music in the car, I think, but I didn't start buying my own records until I was a bit older. But they knew that I was into it, so there would occasionally be presents for holidays or birthday of an album or a single. And then I think, around that time, probably as I got a little bit older, besides my Beatles obsession, I would just start reading about other bands. In reading articles or books about them, I would discover other groups. And then, that's kind of not long after that, of course, I'd already had a friendship with one of my future bandmates. And then when our third one came along, we all were sort of mutually excited about everything going on with music, but we all have the common language of being initially big Beatles fans.
Yes,
So,
that's. And I was going to
but
say, with your parents, just going back slightly with your parents. So were they both quite bohemian then, kind of artistic, kind of bohemian types?
yeah, I mean, my folks, my at the time, my mom was still pursuing an acting career, and my father was working as an actor. My mom also worked in various capacities as a production assistant. Worked before my time. Worked briefly for a company called Gross Court, which was Albert Grossman and John Court. They managed Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul and Mary and Odetta. My mom worked for them, I think around 1963, 64 for a brief spell. Probably why we had some Bob Dylan, Odetta, and Peter, Paul and Mary records that were promos in my mom's collection.
Yes.
And my folks were just, yeah, all their friends in New York were also aspiring actors and writers, and they knew some musicians as well. And then I'm actually a woman that my mom went to high school with, who I've learned about over the years, and they're still in touch, is a singer named Martha Velez, who made a couple of really cool records in the 70s and who was part of the Woodstock community. So my mom always had an appreciation for music and has a nice singing voice. My father had a lovely singing voice as well, but music was more my thing,
Yes.
whereas acting and the other stuff. My mother ended up having a very long career as a casting director for feature films. So I grew up in show business, but the music thing was more of my thing. And the
Yes.
other stuff was, but it's all sort of interrelated. And then, so as far as my friends in the band, my initial friendship with my down the street neighbor Stephen Wolfson, who's the main songwriter and lead singer in The Motion. Stephen's parents just had sort of regular. His mom ran a family business that distributed party picks and swizzle sticks and sort of cocktail accessories. And his father had been an attorney, but his grandfather had been a Hollywood screenwriter. And so he was always interested in writing, I think, from an early age. The musical thing sort of, we were both, met each other when we were like 7 or 8 years old. So we both discovered a lot of things together. When a few years passed and we were just, obsessed with music and, everything related to, that time in popular culture, obviously, whatever was on the radio and television. Of course, movies were a big thing for us too. So we were all, the year that we met our third bandmate, Paul, Star Wars had come out. We were all obsessed with that as well. But Paul Riopel, who's the band's lead guitarist, Paul had a sister who moved downstairs from me and my mom in 1977. And so I saw this kid who was a couple years older hanging out. It's like, oh, blah, blah. So, we met down on the street or in the driveway or whatever, discovered that we were all into the same stuff. But his father, Paul's dad, that is, was a performing musician. He was a songwriter and record maker. His name was Jerry Riopel. And Jerry had a very interesting career in the 60s, as we later found out. He had done everything from being a side man for artists to becoming a session musician and a producer, worked with Phil Spector, signed as a writer to A&M, had a studio group. Like, he did every job you could do in the music business until he decided to start making his own records. And so Paul grew up kind of seeing all of that up close, like going to a recording studio, going to concerts, watching things be created, very much, seeing the process unfold. So by the time we all met, he had a bit more knowledge than we did, but we all had a mutual enthusiasm. We all, ironically, all played the drums. And then once we got together, realizing that something had to happen, after some initial forays into just singing along to Beatles records with tennis rackets to impress our friends, we had to make the leap, and they learned how to play guitar. And then I learned how to play the bass guitar, and we kind of rotated instruments. So this takes us up to maybe like 79. We're like working in the garage and eventually getting it together to have folks over, play concerts in our backyard, but just still the three of us switching instruments and mostly learning on the job writing our own material. We weren't very good at learning other people's songs. As
Yes.
much as we loved it, we could not begin to figure out how we would play a Beatles song or something like that. But that was kind of the explosion for us, is that we had an in-house coach or guide to kind of check in on us now and then and see where we were headed. So Jerry was very helpful in that regard.
Yes, God, that's a very good bit of mentoring. Just on that theatre front, I know I'm a bit obsessed with theatre, because you had those kind of very experimental 60s, theatre companies. There was the Cockettes, there was Living Theatre. Was it Bread and Butter Theatre Company? I think that was on the West Coast. I mean, there was a lot of performance artists and some wild stuff. Did your parents kind of brush against that, or was that a quite different scene?
My folks definitely knew they were both. My mom had me relatively young. I mean, my mother only just turned 80 this past spring, so she was in her 20s, and my dad was a few years older. But they were very much in the mix with the people that they knew socially, just on the scene in New York, would be like Dustin Hoffman and Elliot Gould and people like that. Of course, Elliot was married to Barbara Streisand. Years later, my mom ended up working for her, like out here in Los Angeles for a while. So yeah, they knew. I mean, they were friends with people who were on the scene. Like my folks both had tiny acting gigs in a movie called Alex in Wonderland, directed by Paul Mazursky. Many years later, my dad and I would see Paul all the time out here in LA at the farmers market, which is a collection of little kiosks and stands near where I live. And Paul would always be holding court. So like decades later, I sort of reacquainted myself with some of the people from my father and mother's early days, before I was really on the scene. So they always kept, connected to that time in their lives. I mean, regardless of where they're, obviously a lot of actors moved out to California in the 70s because this is where the work was, and television was kind of where a lot of people's income was happening. So that's, what, the play brought them out here, but the TV work kept my dad here. And then my mom was working, doing various production and assisting jobs, and it kind of put acting on the back burner for herself. And then she ended up, like I said, getting a job working for Barbara Streisand and John Peters on the remake of A Star Is Born with Barbara and Chris Christopherson. She worked as an assistant to them, to John and Barbara. And at the end of that process, the director of that film enjoyed working with my mom and said, I need your help. I'm going to do this picture. I need someone that can look at actors and help me sort through stuff. So she took that job, much to John and Barbara's displeasure. And then she started working, assisting the casting person on this next movie. And then that led to her career doing casting herself. And she did that just until a couple of years ago. So I grew up going to movie sets and TV shoots and watching plays staged. I've always been connected to that part of performing. But like I said, like the musical thing was around and an appreciation of it. But
Yes.
my mom had a guitar and had taught herself some chords, I think, way back when, but I did, I got more use out of it than she did. But she certainly still loved music. She still does. And my father always did as well. But I didn't have something like my bandmate Paul, where there was direct, there's a guy in the house who's writing a song and making a demo, and you're going to go watch him record it, and he's going to have, real people playing. And I mean, that was a huge deal for us. And also the kind of, like I said, at this point, we're all in our early teens and we're starting to get together. So you can cast your memory back to new technology at the time. Paul and his dad would sometimes do joint ventures and buy equipment together, because Paul had a bit of a career as a young actor doing some TV commercials and television work. So the money that he made from that, they put aside for him, but he was allowed to spend it occasionally on things he wanted. Like they wanted to get, they were the first people I knew that had a VCR and could record. So we would endlessly watch what had been on Saturday Night Live like the night before. So all that great early, first few years of Saturday Night Live, when the musical guests were incredible, we could watch those performances over and over again long before you had anything where you could look up, clips. And one of the other things that was a huge thing for us, just as a performance thing, was Paul's dad took us to see The Kids Are All Right here in Los Angeles when it premiered at the Cinerama Dome, which was amazing to only have had at that point. Like, I knew about the Who, they made this record Tommy, and I knew the song Pinball Wizard, and I didn't know much else about them. But then to watch The Kids Are All Right, all of us were there. It was like, what is going on here? It's incredible. And then not long after, there was a local, it may have just been California based, but there was a cable on demand service called On TV. And it was like you bought a decoder box and put it on your TV set, and programming would come through it. And it was literally that simple. You paid a fee and they installed this thing. And they showed what was probably not quite authorized, some version or a bootleg version of The Kids Are All Right on their service. Paul recorded it. And then I think every day for the next year, we would go over to his house after school and just watch The Kids Are All Right and watch the Who performing. It's like, that's like, we got to learn how to do more of that. So as a result, our little trio, which at that time we were probably called the Last Chance Band,
Yes.
you know, we would run these concerts in our backyard, and we would have, you know, smoke, you know, fog effects, you know, we'd have attempted smashing of things. We were obsessed with the Who's performance thing. And then Jerry and Paul bought a initial 4-track cassette Tascam Portastudio, which was like a revolutionary thing. Previously then, the best, most home recording musicians might have, you know, if you had a bit of money, you could have like a 2-track or 4-track open reel recorder, but you still needed a mixing board and whatnot. So the Portastudios were, you know, self-contained 4-track unit that recorded on a regular cassette. The mixing board was built in. You just could plug directly into it with your instrument, or you plug a microphone into it. So we had a very elaborate setup with a microphone and another cassette recorder with a microphone set up to record drums, and then put all the instruments directly into the mixer. And we made a really polished demo tape for the time. I mean, we were 13 years old.
Yeah.
That one's not on Spotify. But sadly, it's just the quality. I mean, actually, some of it is pretty good as far as the playing and singing, especially for our age. But the quality of what we have left is pretty rough. Like, it wouldn't really sound so good up on a streaming site. But we hope someday to find the original version of it.
Yes.
But what we did is, you know, we, again, because it was just the times and we didn't know better, we finished up making these recordings, and then we copied some cassettes and made a little label, and we just sent them out to clubs, you know, in Los Angeles. So we sent a tape to this health food restaurant called the Natural Fudge Company, and we sent one to the Troubadour and to the Whiskey, to send it to places like that. Just, you know, I mean, that's what you did, right? Like, or we thought that's how you did it.
Yes.
And we still didn't have a full-time drummer. We just, the three of us were taking turns. So two things happened. We got a gig at this health food restaurant, and we thought, well, we should really get a drummer. So Stephen went to a school, a very cool progressive private school called Newbridge, and there was an older guy named Eric Satzman who was a drummer. And Stephen said, hey, would you want to get together and play? So it's like, kind of like, you know, at that point in your life, like a year or two difference is a big deal when you're 13, 14 years old. But he was cool. He was into it. So this huge drum kit showed up, and, you know, we started rehearsing with him. So we played this restaurant, you know, packed it with our friends and family. Then we got a proper gig at the Troubadour. And that was pretty funny because our folks, you know, had to drive us there and, you know, help us in with our gear. But Paul's mom, Naomi, had worked for a decade at the Troubadour during its height, like mid 60s to mid 70s. She was one of the main waitresses there. And she actually is the waitress with the famous John Lennon incident of being kicked out of the club for heckling and all that. She had many classic moments, you know, for a decade of working at that place. And I think that might have been just a little bit of, not deja vu, but a little full circle. It's like, you used to work here and bring your son with you because, you know, you couldn't afford a sitter, so you just had him hang out at the club at night. Now he's on stage with his buddies playing music. It was a pretty interesting moment. And again,
Yes.
a really good thing for us to be able to be in that position. You know, the Troubadour, of course, still is a legendary place, and everybody knows about the old days and, you know, Elton John's first performance in the States, and Eagles, Linda Ronstadt, all that stuff. But, you know, which we did not really know anything about so much when we were kids yet, but we just knew that this was a place we'd heard about, and it was like, it was a real place. You know, we played in our garages and our backyards. Like we'd done stuff where we would invite our friends to come and see us. And we've put pictures of this recently up on our social media so we can finally share that more with people. But the Troubadour was a really big deal. And so now we had a drummer. And so we attempted to do some more demo recording. And then said drummer, Eric, had to make it, he was going away to college. And we'd also added a keyboard player at that time, a kid named Eric Suttleson, who I'd met at my middle school. And so we needed another drummer. So when school started for Stephen, he asked if anybody played drums in the class. And this kid, with glasses and tall, long arms, raised his hand and said, I play the drums. We, went up to his house. And that's where we met Ryland Allison, who's became, the drummer for The Motion.
Yes.
And Ryland's family connections were interesting too, because Ryland's mother and his stepfather were television producers and did tons. Ended up doing tons of shows like Blossom and whatnot. They had a very successful career doing TV. Ryland's father was a guy named Keith Allison, who had been like a LA music scene session guy. He'd come from Texas with Michael Nesmith and that whole crew in the mid 60s, came out to LA. And Keith started working as a session guy and had his own career, and then joined Paul Revere and the Raiders and had a long run with them. So again, Ryland grew up totally immersed with music around all the time and kind of in a show business family as well. But music was his thing. And of course, he had his dad, dragging him along to things. So Ryland has many classic tales of growing up, playing Keith Moon's drum kit and hanging out with all these guys. His dad and Ringo were very good friends for years. So sort of interesting thing. And funnily enough, I didn't know some of this. We knew when we were kids, but I did not know till relatively recently some of the escapades in terms of, Ringo showing him stuff on the drums and him getting sort of firsthand, instruction. It's like, wow, I've known you since we were teenagers, and only now are you telling me about you playing Ringo's drum kit in his house? He goes, well, it's just that's what it was, just like hanging out with your dad's friends.
Yes, my God, that's amazing.
So the funny thing is like all of this though is in almost complete isolation, and that we really did not know any other people in bands, partly because of our age. I knew some other people at school. We all did, like other people that played musical instruments or that were stuff like Stephen and Ryland went to this private school together, Newbridge. An older kid named Lenny played guitar, who was, getting a group together, and that was Lenny Kravitz. But at that time, he was just an older kid who was like talking a big game about all his plans and dreams or whatever. And it's like, okay. So, yes, we did sort of jam together once in the recreation room at their school as we rehearsed for a student carnival. But I can't say that anybody had any idea of anything, until much later when he was going around town doing his Romeo Blue character, and then eventually, became Lenny Kravitz. So, but just kind of a funny side note. But we really didn't know other musicians. So we were very insular in that regard. We really just kind of did our own thing. We mostly concentrated on original songs. Like I said, Stephen was the primary writer. Occasionally Paul would help him with a song, or we'd like jam on something. But Stephen was a very proficient songwriter and always coming up with more material and more ideas. And so the demo tape that, Pat posted a few weeks ago, what happened there was we realized that we wanted to do something proper, like make a real recording of us. At this point, the keyboard player had left because he was more interested in playing baseball at school and didn't really want to focus on music. So we had our opportunity to, like, Jerry's going to take us into a studio. We're going to record drums for real, more like one mic, or, like try and make it sound okay with, a cassette recorder. It's like, we're going to really record at a proper studio. And then you just kept rehearsing and working on these songs and working on stuff. Then Stephen and his sister were in an accident. They were in a car that was hit by a bus, which was thankfully not anywhere near as terrible as it could have been, but it put us off recording for a while since his arm was in a cast and couldn't really play guitar easily. But we just spent more time working on the songs. We actually had a very funny moment, I guess it could only happen in LA. We were all Christmas shopping at a big mall out here called the Beverly Center, and we saw John Entwistle with some shopping bags, like doing his Christmas shopping. We were flabbergasted that a guy from The Who was in LA, and we introduced ourselves. He couldn't have been nicer. I think he signed Stephen's cast, offered us, a little bit of encouragement. It was a big moment. And, eventually Stephen got better, hand out of the cast. And then we went that following summer in 83 to a studio in Westwood, a little place called Track Recording that a friend of Jerry's owned. And Jerry took us in there, and we were just going to record, our songs like with guide vocals and scratch guitars and do the drums. And Ryland's folks came down to listen and were so impressed with how it sounded. They just asked Jerry, like, how many days would you need here to get it really done properly? And he goes, like, probably, a couple, 3-4 days. They're like, let's do it. So they paid for the studio time. And so we could stay there for the week and really make what's one of the reasons the tape is so polished, is that we had a lot of time to really work on it. And we were already prepared. So then we had our very professional, demo. And at that point, it was kind of weird. It was like we'd felt like we'd already really accomplished something just by doing this. But then, some guy came by that knew the guy at the studio and said, like, I'd like to take this and like try and pitch it to my friends. I want to start a label for rock bands at Motown, and you guys could be the first band. It's like we'd hear all these things, but it's like, even with connections in the industry, it's like we didn't really know what to do with any of it. We were also all still in high school,
Yes.
so it's not like there was really an option for like, give it all up and let's just like get out on the road. It was kind of like, well, we'll keep playing gigs at clubs and, telling our friends that we have a tape and stuff. I think one regret from that time is that we didn't really have the wherewithal to manufacture cassettes or a 7-inch piece of vinyl, which would have been the only options at the time, and kind of expensive for us then too. So we would make, dub off copies of our demo and give them to friends, and they would have it. But, that's the only way we could get the music out there.
Yes. During that period, just going back slightly, there was obviously the slightly classic rock period of the early to mid 70s with, Frampton Comes Live,
Right.
Lots of
Frampton
kind
Comes
of
Alive
great
and all that,
Boston, and there was Cheap Trick. And then what did punk do to you guys? And that kind of post-punk period with people like Elvis Costello and Nick Lowe and Joe Jackson and people like that.
It's funny because I talk about this all the time with older friends and younger friends too. Punk rock, I think generationally and geographically means very different things to a lot of people. People that grew up here in LA, the Los Angeles punk scene, which, some of us were kind of into and knew some of those bands. And, I'm actually a pivotal thing for Stephen and I when we were, I think, both 13. His older brother, David, took us end of 1980, almost between Christmas and New Year's, I think. We went to the Whiskey A Go-Go not long before it closed up to see X, who were a huge Los Angeles band. And really, everyone will still to this day attest that they were musically kind of miles above a lot of the LA punk scene. Was more slashing chords, angular, like, they had energy and a lot of power, but they had a lot of ability and they had interesting songs and harmonies. And that made a big impression on him and I, for sure. I think as far as the other bands that you mentioned, we all were into what was happening in music at that time. So we were certainly into Elvis Costello and the Police and Joe Jackson and all that kind of stuff. And then sort of because of our age and where we were, we're still like we weren't necessarily all going out to see a lot of shows or see as many gigs as we could have or should have. But, we also had this other thing musically where Paul's father, Jerry, was making records and doing shows and had this huge, regional success in Arizona due to radio play. So we would go watch him do gigs up close, like go to a big venue and like see a sound check and see how all of it worked, and then kind of learn from that and put it back into just trying to do a better job of what we were doing. But what was interesting too is that musically, the other thing that was really changing at the time is that, you had a lot more kind of technology became more available to people. So, it was a big deal. One Christmas, Ryland got an Oberheim synthesizer for a present, and that was a great sound that we wanted to explore, like maybe having a keyboard player again. And then you're hearing different kind of things in music, like the bands that you mentioned, but also just pop music in general in the early 80s. There's a whole lot of other stuff happening. It's like you've got all the electronic stuff coming over, which we were into as well. All of us were into those bands, whether it was, the kind of shift where, like you said, Joe Jackson, Elvis Costello Jam, like a lot of English groups, they went through changes. Some of them break up. It's like Paul Weller's not in the Jam anymore. He's got this new band with this guy. Like the Style Council, for example, was a
Yes.
huge band for me and Steven. We were big fans. We actually saw their only U.S. gig, or one of their only U.S. gigs here in Los Angeles, which was a huge thing for us because at that point, that's kind of where we're like heading to a different place musically, I think. And that's actually the interesting thing about this time is that, so circa 1984, you know, Steven's finishing up school. Paul had already graduated high school. Rylan and I still had another year to go. We did this really cool gig playing out in Westwood at the Federal Building to entertain the Olympic athletes, which was like playing on this huge stage. And there's video of it. It was great fun. We made a new recording, kind of using new technology. We were in Jerry's home studio, and Rylan actually just programmed a drum machine with different drum samples and didn't play a drum kit, but just played, you know, a keyboard with drum sounds. And he and Jerry worked together on that. And, you know, Steven had a song that was, you know, something we wanted to record, but it's like we were sort of seeing the change and stuff. It's like here we were not all playing together at the same time, but just trying to craft a little demo track or, you know, whatever you want to call it. And it was just, you know, there's also changes coming up too. It's like Paul ended up not in the group after a little while because he was going through kind of some life changes, like, you know, figuring out what's next for him as far as, you know, you're done with school and it's like, what are you going to do? You know, because I don't think there was ever an option for us to think of the band as being something we could pursue as a way to make a living. Plus, Steven had already, you know, forged a path to going to university and getting a degree. Then Ryland went to Cal Arts, which is a very well-known school out here in Los Angeles that caters to creative types and wants to, you know, put them on a path. So he was exploring composition and learning about orchestration, learning about how to do, you know, more music stuff. And Steven and I ended up, you know, staying together and having two other bands after sort of this initial disbanding of the Motion per se. But it's also just the times, you know, it's like everybody's sort of like, there's all this new stuff going around. There's new sounds, there's new ways to look at things. And that was a big thing for us. I think Steven and I maybe had the opportunity to stay working together for the next 4 or 5 years because we both shared a lot of interests musically. And so we just worked with other people that we knew through school. In my case, I found us a keyboard player and a drummer that I'd known for years. And we just did, you know, another band for a couple of years called Man on Fire. And then that went away. And then we did another band called 10 Feet Tall. And then Steven met a singer-songwriter and wanted to just work as like a folk duo. And that kind of was the end of our time working together. This takes us up to about 89, 90. And always still remaining friends. I mean, there was never a period where we weren't friends with each other. It was just the music thing had gone away, but the friendship never did. And I'd always said in hindsight that the friendship was the reason the band came about in the first place. So the friendship was going to remain even if the band didn't. But then periodically there would be get-togethers for, you know, the hell of it or someone's birthday or whatnot. And then the two things that really led to us reuniting were I started making a record of my own almost 20 years ago, actually a little bit longer. And as a surprise, I invited Steven, Paul, and Ryland without telling anybody what I wanted them to do. Just, hey, come to the studio on this day. It's like, I want you to do something with me. So all of them showed up, as did Paul's parents. And we had a reunion, which was great fun. We recorded a very old song from our initial childhood demos and just had a great day hanging out. And then I think we talked about doing a gig for someone's birthday. It might have been Paul's birthday. So we did that. And then it's just basically like reintegrating into being in a band together. But it took a little while to like start it back up again and kind of get into the mindset of what are we doing? Like, are we trying to relive our childhood? Or are we trying to be who we are at this age? And so, you know, two things happened. We did some of that. And then Paul's dad was doing return to his big New Year's Eve gigs in Arizona at the Celebrity Theater, which is like a 3,000 seat in the round venue that's been there since the 60s. And he invited us to open up for him. So we had a gig on New Year's Eve where we played to a sold out crowd. And most of them were completely unaware of us. I mean, they maybe knew that Jerry's son had a band or something, but it was great to play to basically a bunch of strangers. Although all of Steven's family came out, as did my mom and a bunch of our pals. I mean, it was a great night. And after that, we decided, hey, let's make a record. So we started making a record with a couple friends of ours, and
Yes.
then that's the what became Whatever Pleases You. And at the time, Ryland was about to become a father, so he sort of ducked out after the initial tracking and had to focus on his kid coming. And then, we finished up the record, and didn't really know what to do as far as promoting it. And again, it's funny to think how things shift. Like now, in 2023, here we are getting people interested talking about us as a band that used to be and exists again. But people can hear our 40-year-old demo tape of our teenage years, as well as the record we made 14 years ago. And it's just all easily found at various streaming sites. But in 2009, the conversation was, well, are we going to press up CDs? And then, vinyl is so expensive and I don't know, or should we make, it was like, we didn't really know quite what to do, because also, again, at that point in your life, everybody is locked into some kind of job or career. A couple people have family obligations. It's like, you can't really just drop everything and start being a group again, other than you can get together and play for fun. So that took us a little bit of time to figure out. We did a couple of gigs where we'd have different guests. We had a different drummer for a little bit because Ryland couldn't do it. And then once that all got worked out and realized, like, let's just have fun again and not worry about anything else, that's kind of where it came back. And that's where we are today, is that when we do a show, it's a lot of old friends and family, but we've got new friends and new fans as well. And doing something like this makes perfect sense, because here are you, thousands of miles away, just seeing a post about something from someone that you're connected with through something else. You go, oh, this is interesting. And you listen to it and you're like, well, this is cool. It's like, well, what about this? Or like, where does this fit into everything?
Yes.
And that's kind of, I think, one of the things that's happened. Obviously, social media has infiltrated every aspect of our lives. And in the best sense, we're connected here through this link up, having a chat about something that you're curious about. And I'm giving you the story, with all these details that you would never have known any other way, because no one's going to write an article or publish a book on, a group from LA that never, went anywhere other than LA. But it ties into all these other things of, like, there's always, like, we would be very fascinated to read about some group, from, Manchester in 1966 that cut 2 singles, and then everybody just went back to their job, at the factory. Like, we would be curious about, like, oh, that was such a good song. It's like, what happened? It's like, oh, we couldn't really get anything going.
Yes.
And I kind of feel like we had a little bit of a version of that, with sort of being a little bit of a big fish in a small pond, meaning our little section of Los Angeles. LA was teeming with tons of stuff, but it's like we were just in our little world. We only knew, like, the stuff we knew. We didn't know other bands or really, network with people or anything like that. We just kind of did our own thing. And so, funnily enough, some of the musicians from our time, like from our scene, gone on to great success. One of my high school mates was Rami Jaffe, who's been in the Foo Fighters for years, and prior to that was in the Wallflowers, and he's still a Motion fan. Our old friend Josh, who was one of the guys that started the band Warrant, he actually filled in and played guitar with us a couple of years back. It's just kind of funny. It's like how it all comes in a big circle and people's lives go in different directions, but it's like they can have a commonality of something that they liked when they were a kid, and then they find a way to, reconnect with it.
Yes.
It doesn't mean we're getting a slot opening up for the Foo Fighters or anything, but it's nice.
No,
it
but I think
it wouldn't be crazy if Rami played our demo for those guys.
No, but it's interesting because I think there is a sense of, I don't know, archiving, but there's also a sense of looking back at a scene, not necessarily with rose-tinted sunglasses, but sometimes thinking, actually, that was quite interesting. Things, because for a long time, the 60s had this great, God, the 60s, if only we were born in the 60s. The 70s got a bit of a bad deal. And then people are going, actually, the 70s were quite good. And then rejigged it a bit. And the 80s, there was a certain narrative with the 80s. And then suddenly there's been like digging down and going, actually, because I found that people would sort of talk about the 80s, and I thought that's not my 80s at all. I was into indie pop, I was into the Smiths and all these
Yeah.
jingly jangly bands. And then, there's been lots of books that have started coming out about all these scenes, and they get very specific because you talk about bands who didn't last long. There was a film that was made last year on a band called Rima Rima, who only lasted for 8 months and put out one EP, and someone made a film about them because it was kind of a fascinating story. And when you see the film, you realize there's quite a lot. But that was the first band that got signed to 4AD Records. All the members kind of went on to other things. There was and the film also mentions this guy called James Elliott who makes perfume, and he has a sort of a neuro thing that goes on that means that when he hears noise, it kind of create, he can.
Oh, is it synesthesia?
Synesthesia, yes, he has that. So he's made a perfume from this band's record called Rima Rima, and so there's this kind of, again, from this nothing, almost nothing, comes this kind of like amazing history, and you just unpack it, and then you watch this fascinating film about a band that basically probably only sold 500 EPs, but then they found other bits and pieces. They put together a compilation. They've even managed
to. The beauty of it is that you made something. Of course, we've seen other examples of this with greater or longer reaching impact. But one of the other things that's funny too, and again, it's occupational hazard of growing up in Los Angeles and being around certain things and scenes where you just end up meeting people. And I'm an outgoing personality, and I like chatting with people. I went. I went every Tuesday night in the early 90s here in Los Angeles to a club in Hollywood called Raji's, which was in the bottom of this dilapidated hotel. And it's just a place where bands played. And there's a big famous picture of Nirvana playing there and all that. But there was a band that played there every Tuesday night for almost 2 years called Continental Drifters that was at different points, several, people from other bands, people from the Dream Syndicate, the DBs, the Bangles, Cowsills. They all became and still are very good friends. And so all these years later, like a parallel world where we were, bands that we grew up listening to or looking at, it's like, oh my God, it's like, I love this band, or so it's like, I'd love to meet so-and-so, or it'd be so cool to do a gig. It's like, I've become friends with all these people over the years, just in the most roundabout ways. And, that they are sort of intrigued about, like, oh my God, I saw this thing of your old band. It's so cute. Like you guys are jumping around with your, smoke bombs going off or whatever. Like I would have, couldn't even have dreamt about having that conversation with somebody like that back then, because we just didn't know any of those people. Now that like enough time has shifted and you're sort of friends with people in a different way. And again, because of like, people can look back, like you said, someone might talk about the 80s in a pejorative, like, oh, well, the 80s are like, well, that's not what I remember. Or it's like, there are all these cool bands and all this cool stuff. And I think that it's also the difference. I suppose that another thing that the internet has done has been a bit of a leveler, and that people used to look at things that's like, oh, well, it's like a big popular success. Like, one thing about 80s bands that had big hits, that really made an impact is that back then it wasn't just, the radio and the record sales. It's like MTV was a huge thing for all of us too. We all watched it all the time. But it's like you couldn't escape it. So it's like even a non-musical person that just loves music as a thing to put on in the background while they're doing the dishes or whatever, it's like they would know the hook and the drum beat, the ever to these songs, because they were everywhere. It's like, it wasn't just like you heard it once. It was sort of like, everyone's air drumming to Tears for Fears or whatever it is. It's like things were huge records in a different way than maybe they would have been in the 50s, 60s, or 70s because of the visual component. But my point is that I think there's a lot about the 80s that people genuinely love, even with people looking at, every era has its excess and its cliches, and it's like, oh, that band or whatever. And some people are just naturally dissenters or, contrarians. It's like they can't love anything that's popular, or they can't allow themselves to believe that anything that's that popular is that good. I encounter this all the time with people who always want to have the edge and know about, oh, well, this is the cool thing. And like, you're just into the whatever, but it's like, I know about the real thing. It's like, you know what? It's all valid. And if somebody enjoys it, it's also one of those things that's like bands themselves change. It's like, if you go to see Depeche Mode now, Martin Gore is playing guitar and rocking out, and there's a drummer with a huge kit. It's like, these aren't like four guys standing behind, like looking like craft work. It's totally different. But it's like, their music changed. Their audience still supports it. Obviously, they're still very popular. We didn't have anything to do with them other than we were fans of what they did. But it's like there's always going to be a place for two guitars, bass, drums, and people singing and making music in that style. I think
Yes.
there's going to be obviously a whole new world where somebody can just do a show with modern technology if they are communicating something and bringing it to people in a way that they can relate to it and they can respond to it, then they don't need to do what's been done before, or they can just take elements of it. And that's kind of what has happened now for a lot of things. It's like people can now appreciate what goes on multiple levels. It's not sort of like, oh, you're one of those guys, like you're into techno music, or it's like, oh, you're just an old dude who wants to get stoned and listen to 10-minute guitar solos. It's like, both things can coexist. Sometimes they can even interrelate, collaborate or cross over into things where it's like you would not expect certain things to happen musically. It's just that people are open to it. I mean, I'm tickled, we all are, that anybody would be interested in something from our childhood that, we look at back fondly because we were the people that did it and it's what helped get us to the next phase. But somebody coming at it fresh from like, wow, this is you guys at 16? Oh, this is really cool. And we want them to listen to the record we made in our 40s, of course, and we're going to make new music. We're going to actually do a recording session next weekend at Ryland's home studio and do a brand new song, which
Amazing.
for us, yeah, that to me, that's the victory, is that it's like, we're all still here. We're all still able to do this. So there's no reason not to, because it was never about making money at it or having it be what your career was necessarily. But we've all pursued, Paul worked in a really cool computer music thing for years with his father and played in other bands. Ryland had ages working for Hans Zimmer on big film scores, raising kids, doing all kinds of, electronic design and, programming for companies. Stephen had a career as a playwright and a screenwriter and now teaches at UCLA. I've worked for 25 years at a guitar shop in Santa Monica called True Tone. That's like my bread and butter work thing, but it's related to, and I've met, a litany of musicians in that job, which is kind of like, again, another childhood fantasy come true, whether it's Ry Cooder or Prince or Jackson Browne or whoever. It's like all these people that were or are customers of ours are all part of it too. And so it's kind of funny, it's like, if you're open to things and you don't just go, oh, well, that was then, we can't, I can't go back to that, you'll miss out on some stuff, just by saying yes to doing a gig with somebody or saying, okay, let's do this or let's have that. It's like, like I said, we played this gig like 10 years ago and Jackson Browne came to see my band because he knew me from the guitar shop.
Oh,
It's like,
fantastic.
but I think it's like there's a whole other connection where it's like it could just be about that one thing. It's not like, what does it mean or where will it lead? It's like, it's not going to lead to anywhere. It's going to lead to, hey, thanks for coming out. See you later. It's like
Yes.
that's all it has to be.
Yes. And
And I think
probably, yes, and probably trouble trying to sleep after the adrenaline excitement of
exactly.
it.
Well, that's always the thing. It's like that's the life of a musician, is that it's like you kind of get all revved up to go and play, and you do it, and then you're like up for a while afterwards because you gotta wind down.
Yes, I think going with something that you said a bit earlier, about 3 minutes ago, that I
Yeah.
think that in the 80s and possibly, I don't know what it's like now, but it was very tribal. I don't think you could go from one scene to another without feeling like Judas. I think there was like, you were an indie kid or you were electronic kid or you were
Yeah,
into.
I mean, I know about that nature of certain scenes like that, and I'm sure it may have been different in different cities as well. There was a big thing here in LA when you're talking about the punk time. There were like the original punk rock LA people who then looked at some of the later bands that came along that were like doing what we might call new wave music with like more clicky eighth note guitars and old suits and skinny ties and playing that kind of music. It's sort of like, oh, I don't want to. It's like, that's not cool to them. The end result is like, if you eliminate your, you know, preconceptions about that stuff. And here's another example. So when we're talking about music changing and all this other stuff flowing about, it's like I mean, and Stephen and I were not the only people like this, but it's like, I remember he and I went to see Frankie Goes to Hollywood play out here in Los Angeles at the Palace nightclub. And it was incredible. I loved that record. I bought every Frankie 12-inch and 7-inch single. I was really into any record that Trevor Horn produced. But at the same time, it's like I love the Replacements, or I still love the Beatles and all the 60s bands that I was into. And I still was into all kinds of other music. It's like you can appreciate things for what they are, not for whether it's better or worse than the thing you hold up as an ideal. And I think that's the interesting thing about now is that maybe because so many people are consuming music just sort of off a platter that keeps spinning around, it's like it's a different thing. It's not like you're going to search out one particular thing. I have a good friend, Andrew Sandoval, who's a reissue record producer, archivist, and also works, with artists setting up tours and stuff. One of his passions is collecting obscure 60s singles by tons of different artists, not just American or British or European, but he has literally thousands and thousands of original 45s in his collection that he's gone through, scanned, digitized, and like cataloged. A lot of this music not available any other place, never going to be reissued by one of the major labels, never going to be anthologized. Just sort of, here's a band that cut 3 sides, 50 years ago, put it out to the world, and it, went to 99 in the charts, in Guam or whatever. That's it. It's over.
Yes.
So, appreciating things for what they are, even if there's all it is just, hey, I'm going to play this and 100 or 1,000 people might listen to it on my internet radio show. Well, that's something. There's a young singer-songwriter that I met a few years ago, and he came out to LA to make it, and he's had a hard time, and he's had a series of day jobs and multiple setbacks. And I just said, if you can't not do it, like if you can't walk away from this because you were driven to it, then, you're a lifer. You're going to be a musician and a singer and a performer, but you're going to have to find a way to make a living because this is not going to sustain you. It was always tough, but it's harder now to monetize anything and to make it pay for itself. But if you write a song and record it and put it out on your website and 10 people or 100 people respond to it, well, that's an audience. I have no idea going forward. Obviously, we can look at the historical examples of how things have changed and how the music business and everything is so different, but nothing's ever going to stop people wanting to pick up a guitar or a drum or a piano or something and have an idea and then find some way to, share it or communicate it. I mean, obviously the methodology has changed and the way that people consume stuff has totally changed. And, I don't expect to ever make any money playing music. I never did.
Yeah,
But
no.
I know that when people look, that band that you mentioned, that this guy's made a documentary about them from their brief moment, the last thing any of them probably would have thought was like, who would even know about us? Or it's like we barely made a blip then, but it was obviously the beginning of something. 4AD was a huge, very influential record label. Yes, but it's like the fact that all these years later, somebody is taking the time to tell their story. I think that's fascinating.
It is fascinating. We love those stories, and almost the more obscure that is the better. That's the thing that
right. It's that discovery. It's like you want to know what makes things tick. Pat Thomas also, does tons of anthologizing and archiving and stuff, and just digging through and finding out the stories sometimes. Like I said, it's, again, also it's the strange interconnectedness of things. Like I mentioned, my mom's high school friend, Martha Velez, who made records. I literally just got a copy of her. She made 2 records, one called Friends and Angels, another one called Escape from Babylon. And so this is a friend of my mom's from high school who in the 70s made a record with everybody from Eric Clapton and Jack Bruce to Paul Kossoff, and then made another record a couple years later with Bob Marley and the Wailers, right? And I did not know anything about this woman until years later. But my friend Pat was working on this project, this research thing about Van Morrison, and he wanted to get in touch with Martha. And I go like, oh, it's funny. My mom they grew up together. He's like, wow, can she connect me with her? So he ends up having this conversation online with Martha last year about her time working with Van Morrison, just specifically about just, working together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting little bit of like, just because if you are receptive to how people come and go in each other's lives and how they interact and how they end up working together for a moment or not. Again, another friend of my mom's from years ago is a woman named Ruth Ann Friedman, who wrote the song Windy. That was a big hit for the Association. And Ruth Ann got back into music about 15 years ago, thanks to Devendra Banhart and some other people. And she asked if I would play bass with her because my mom mentioned that I was a musician. And so I did. And I ended up reconnecting Ruth Ann with Van Dyke Parks, who I knew, who she had not seen in years, and Jackson Browne, who she had known many years ago as well. And we ended up finishing making her record in Jackson's studio with Van Dyke. This has nothing to do with the motion, but it just
No, but it's a
it
great.
illustrates the story, because that's that same gig where Jackson came to see us play is where Ruth Ann was there, and they were talking. She's like, "I need a place to record Van Dyke playing piano." He's like, "Just call my studio manager. I'll set it up." She's like, "Really?" It's like, "Yeah, old times." So it's just us being in a band as kids and then reuniting as a band in our middle years. Just to me, almost makes perfect sense. I mean, it's a special thing because you're never going to have anything like a lifetime connection, which is what we all have. We've all been through so much together. So many ups and downs and waves of just normal life existing. And the fact that we have this musical thing is great, because a lot of people have a band when they're young, and then everyone goes their separate ways, and then it just turns into like some weird high school reunion where it's sort of like, oh my God, that guy, that was
Yes.
never a problem for us because we never stopped being friends with each other. I think
Yes.
that's the biggest thing. And I again, you doing something like this where you're chronicling, you're helping people tell stories that you're interested in, there's an audience for it as well. I think that that's really, something. And
Yes.
for us,
Well,
for us as a band, I mean, we now, nothing seems too ridiculous. It's sort of like, hey, let's go play a gig here. Okay, cool, let's do this. Or it's like, as long as it's something that we can all agree on and it's fun and we can fit it into our lives, then we want to do it. So, next weekend, Paul's coming out here from Arizona, going to stay for a couple of days. We'll record, go out to dinner, crack each other up, tell stories, and then make a plan like, oh, we finish up the song, we'll put it out. Like, so let's go play a special show somewhere. Like, we're working on trying to get a gig with another friend's band to play someplace cool again, like the Troubadour, like to kind of go back to like a big proper venue with a real stage and PA and everything, just for fun. But I'm up to whatever. I get in the car and drive to Arizona and play some gigs there, or just be open to whatever could happen, because it's not over yet. And as long as there's still something ahead of you, then you've got something to look forward to.
yes, absolutely. I mean, just going slightly just back again, because we talked about the punk, the post-punk period, and then the year 83, which is a
Yeah.
major moment. The Smiths appear, for 5
Right.
years, from 83 to 87. Were the Smiths, did they come onto your radar? Did
Well,
that
in Los Angeles, they had a huge acceptance and popularity at the big local, I guess we call it the alternative radio station out here, K-Rock.
Yes.
Really embraced them. I mean, like college radio did as well, obviously, but we all listened, to that station out here. And I mean, I know Stephen and I did for sure. And I'm pretty sure, I know Paul was a fan as well. I would imagine Ryland was too. I went, there was a great big indie record shop near where we all lived called Aaron's, and they would get all the English, records in, the same week or the next week. So it's like, oh, the new Smith single is out. Or it's like, oh, you got to hear the B-side. It's like they were a huge band, still are for me. I think those records are great. And it's funny, again, one of the happy accidents for me, I've become friendly with Johnny Marr over the last decade. When he's in Los Angeles, he comes to our shop, Santa Monica, and he's bought guitars and hung out. And I've met his son and his wife as well. He's a very nice guy.
Yes.
And he's, opened up a little bit and cracked a few jokes and told a few Smith stories, but just over after years of getting to know him a bit. But it's funny because those records still just take me back to that time. And I think that they really hold up, and of course, the Smiths are like frozen in time to some people because it's like, well, it's just this short period. And then, certainly it's not like Morrissey didn't have a huge career. And I like quite a few of his records. I mean, not every one of them, but Johnny has done so much other music. But his solo thing has been, I mean, I've been a few times to see him live and it's great. And I think that it's funny, the impact again, like they're also a band that was very polarizing for a lot of people, because if you weren't, or people I know were still like, oh, I love the music, I couldn't stand Morrissey, I couldn't take his voice or those lyrics, everything's always like, oh, what was me? It's like, But if you're a teenager and you're going through awkward times and you're feeling isolated or alienated or alone, you can totally relate. And if you're in your 50s and you're just listening back to it, it's not like, oh, let me go back to those old days where I was thinking about, how sad I was. It's just, but that music, there's something about it that I think is very special and personal. And that's the thing, that era, there was a lot of emphasis for some people on making these big, explosive, booming, overwhelming records. And everybody was sort of doing that at a certain point because that's what the radio was playing and everybody wanted to get the attention. But at the core, a lot of that music is just something that you could see people just sitting, working on in their little, studio garage, just getting it together. It's like, yes, it turned into this big thing, but a lot of those huge 80s albums, records that were even much bigger than the Smiths were, there's something very still human and personal at the core of it. It's just what it's dressed up in something else because people wanted to have hits and sell records, and that's what was going on.
Yes, well, I think you had that kind of bombastic kind of Trevor Horn production that came out,
Right.
and then you had,
And
then you had Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen, and then you had the
Right.
Bon Jovi, and then it just got
everything
bigger.
was like everything was this big event. Like everything is like, Jesus Christ, that snare drum is louder than the vocal, or it's like everything sounds like a cannon exploding. And I guess people were just trying to like be heard and get the attention. And it's funny because everybody fell into that. And then it wasn't always obviously the best approach. It's not like every one of those records worked as well as it could have. And some people, especially some older artists back then, probably just fell prey to the label guy and everybody saying it's like, you need to work with this person. We need to get you something like this to make you relevant to these people, which, some people had success with that. And some people probably wish they'd not taken that advice.
But that's kind of interesting because I thought about that very subject, because I think sometimes an artist who has a success in one decade and they have that 5 year and they're on the zeitgeist, and then there's a little bit of a moment, and then they have the next decade and the scene has changed. Those people like David Bowie, people like Rod Stewart, I mean, there's quite a few, aren't there? Robert Plant.
Yeah.
I mean, their solo works during that period are a little bit like, oh, and I think they then realize that as well. And then they get it a bit back together in the 90s, or they certainly think, I must stop doing what I was doing because I got led down that commercial path that wasn't going to quite work. So Bowie had some of his albums kind of remixed or remastered without that 80s production. And it's like, oh yeah, these songs are much better now.
And I totally understand that. And I mean, the remake or redo of Never Let Me Down Again, which, was a record that certainly could have benefited from a more sympathetic, more restrained type of production and engineering. They, I guess he requested that, as part of his plan of what to do with that stuff when I'm gone. That was something that he wanted to see happen. And so he did. On the other hand, it's not everyone's favorite, but I really love that record Tonight, which is the one that followed up Let's Dance, even though some people did not embrace it, to say the least. But I think it's actually really cool. And again, it was like another example of him. It's like, I'm going to cut a few more Iggy Pop songs and get my friends some money, and I'm going to get Tina Turner on a record with me. It's like he had an agenda, I think. But a lot of artists then, and we observed all this stuff as we were, making our music and of course trying to relate to it. It's like, I understand that people were sort of like, this is what's happening. It's like, I want to be in this. Like, I want to do it. I read an interview not too long ago with Nile Rodgers talking about, David Bowie came to him to make what became Let's Dance, sort of like, I like what you do. Like, let's do it. Let's do it. Like, let's make this a thing. And they made a big hit record, and it really turned things around for him. I mean, he was playing huge venues and making money again. And, he'd been through the ringer, I guess, financially and emotionally through his previous record deal and management situation. So the fact that he had a big success, maybe not exactly something he was looking forward to do more of, but it certainly allowed him to do things that might not have been as possible.
Because I think that thing about the record deal and record company and the Tony DeFries and also his marriage, I think there's all those things on top of it. Plus he'd had those 3 years in Berlin making sort of great albums, but going through an awful lot of addiction problems as well. So I can understand why he needed to change. Otherwise, it was going to be more of the same. But probably messy. So I think, I can understand why he would have done that. Like I can understand why he did Tin Machine, because I think he just needed another change. And actually that was definitely what he needed at that time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, every artist goes through periods where they're doing something because there could be a variety of reasons. And, you know, um, to a greater or lesser degree, sometimes people have choices that they make that they regret, but I don't know if anybody who, like, and I'm more like a fan here, looking at back at things that I experienced in real time. you know um I remember being very excited about anything new from anybody that I was a fan of, just because I was so excited that they were still making music. Of
Yes.
course, you look back at certain things and you're like, wow, there's a record I'll never listen to again, yet I still or I bought the deluxe edition with 2 extra songs and a poster because I couldn't help myself. But yeah, I mean, you still are always going to have the stuff that you really touch, with, that you go back and touch base with because it's what, meant the most to you. But I'm still, always delighted to discover something that I read about but never actually took the time to listen to. Like, now I want to go look for that band, you know, on 4AD and, find out about them. But it's the same thing. It's like I bought a record by, a band from the 60s yesterday that I'd heard about but never listened to, called the Blues Project. That was, again, like, it's not going to change my world at this point in my life, but it's cool to hear something from a time where everybody was making new music, and it's like here were some guys doing their version of something that they were interested in. I
Yes.
just Discovery part of it to me is what's always interesting. And I know that there were, a bunch of bands, like, say, in the wake of the Smiths, that all tried to, like, get something like that going, but they didn't maybe have that magic. They didn't have a Johnny Marr coming up with that music, and they didn't have Morrissey delivering that lyric and that melody. So it's like that was a great combination, as were Andy Rourke and Mike Joyce. Of course, it was like a band of people all pulling together, at least for a few years, in the same direction to make something happen. And
Yes.
and and whether or not, you know something being rediscovered years later, like on a very, very tiny level, say my band, if somebody comes to it cold and likes it for what it is and has no preconception or no relation to it, just like, wow, this is cool, like I would have gone to see this back then, you know then to me it's like, well, that's a victory. And it's about nothing else other than the fact that, people make music for a variety of reasons, but I think at the core of it, people make music because they have something they want to express or communicate. And if other people pick up on that and they enjoy it, then that's great on whatever level.
Yes, absolutely. No, but just on that thing of archiving, there's, Cherry Red Records in the UK. I mean, and I don't know, what they're like in the rest of the world, but they're always bringing out all these compilations, and they've obviously done a lot of the 60s. They seem to always have things there, the 67, but they're really going through the 80s stuff now, and they did the C86, and then they went up to C91. Now they're going back to C85, triple CD box sets, which have got, the most obscure songs and flexi discs and people never been able to hear before, and they put those compilations out. And then they did a 7 CD box set on Manchester from a sort of a small period of time, and then they did a 5 CD box set on Liverpool from a small period of time, and then Sheffield, and people are archive. And then there's another guy who's just started a record label called the Precious Recordings of London, who's putting out John Peel and Janice Long sessions from the late 80s and early 90s. And then there's a guy in America called Cloudberry who puts out these obscure indie bands from the 80s that he discovers. And then another person in Germany doing Fire Station Records, and he's finding bands. So people are just enjoying, thinking, oh, look, this band have done a few singles. I'll put a compilation together 30 years later. And suddenly, bingo, that band is suddenly like, my God, someone wants to put our music out. This is fantastic. So I think it's all very valid, because there is kind of genius in a lot of those songs. That's my
And
theory.
I think in the context of, like, when you look at what else was going on, you see it. It's like I said, for all the stuff that we were into and all of our influences, I don't know that you wouldn't necessarily hear some of that in the music we were making or recording, but we were certainly absorbing it all and listening to it. But it's like that's the thing. It's like I'm amazed sometimes when I find out that so and so is a fan of somebody, because I wouldn't think that they'd find any common ground musically, but they are, or somebody's sort of like, oh yeah, that's my favorite guitar player. Again, my friend Brian, who remixed our demo, has worked for 22 years for the Who, and he's told me repeatedly of Pete Townsend was like a huge Eddie Van Halen fan, and would just watch videos of Eddie Van Halen like playing guitar. He said it's not that you necessarily hear any of it in him. Really, it's just sort of like he was fascinated by somebody else doing their music. I mean, yeah, they both play rock and roll guitar, very differently styled, but I think there's always a way for people to appreciate something, whether it's in real time, whether it's years later. And like you said, I mean, here's people starting up, at the record company saying like, we're going to make a 3 CD set of this, scene from this town, and look, I have 2 like 5 CD box sets on the Sound, the Adrian Borland's band,
God,
and
yes.
but I
Jesus.
mean,
I managed to track down quite a few of the members of that band, actually. And before them, they were the Crazies. If you ever get a chance, there's a band called the Crazies.
I don't know about that one, but there's another thing called the Outsiders, which
Yes.
was that Adrian's band before.
Yeah, and the Crazies. You should definitely check out the Crazies.
I'll be looking for that. But see, again, it's like and of course, I'm still addicted to physical product. I mean, I've got like 8,000 CDs in this house. It's ridiculous, but it's like I like having it to look at and touch and read the booklet and whatnot. That's what I do. So again, that was actually a pull for us to make this little EP. We did make a physical version of it as well with an old photo of us, and people were sort of fascinated. Like, I love this picture of you guys. I don't know what I would play this disc on because I don't have a CD player anymore, but online, it's like, yes, you can get it online.
Yes. So does that mean you like things like the Comsat Angels, the Bolshoi, Sad Lovers and Giants, and all those bands as well?
Don't know. I do know the Comsat Angels records. I have all of those, and I was into them. My friend had a band that was a bit like them, sort of at the time, so he introduced me to them and also to the Sound.
Yes.
That's how I knew about that. And but again, it's like I'm always rediscovering stuff too. So I'll probably go and check out some other stuff after this chat today.
Yes. Well, listen to the Bolshoi with Trevor Tanner and Paul Clark, because yes, that'll blow your mind when you hear them. You'll just go, oh my God. And also Sad Lovers and Giants and the Chameleons and all those bands. You need to listen to them all.
Music, but I'll certainly be checking it out.
Yes, I'll send you a link as well to the trailer to this film as well, and you'll go, blimey, that's incredible. So I'm
sorry.
So look, just last question. If you could have whispered something to your 16-year-old self starting out, what would you, if there was something that you could just go, oh yeah, that would have been quite handy. Is there anything in particular?
Keep doing what you're doing and press up something tangible. It's a tiny regret, but I do wish we'd made a piece of vinyl or a cassette at least to have a bit of firmware in the ether to say this existed.
Yes.
Run off 100 singles or made a box of cassettes or something just to have a little totem, a little token of that time. But I mean, in a sense we do, because we still have the music, so we can present it now, all these years later.
And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to David Jenkins for giving me the time for that interview. I will, in the notes below, give you a link to their account on Spotify, Apple Music, Facebook, and all the other usual social media platform sites. Anyway, this has been the C86 Show. I'm David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 Show. Yes, keep it positive and groovy. And also, all these interviews have been archived, so you can find them on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.